Hello, welcome to this video on augmented intervals. At this point, if you've not watched the video on major or perfect intervals, I encourage you to click on the following link and go watch that video first, as it is important to understand that topic before you begin today's topic. So what is an augmented interval? Well, an augmented interval is any perfect or major interval that has been made larger by one semitone. So if you make a perfect unison larger by one semitone, it becomes an augmented. Major second by one semitone larger becomes an augmented second. Major third becomes an augmented third. Perfect fourth, augmented fourth, and so on. Okay, so let's try and build some of these augmented intervals. The steps for building an augmented interval are: build your major or perfect interval first. Okay, so it's very similar. That's why it's important to understand the major and perfect intervals before you begin today. So let's look at some examples. The first ones I've given you, the first two I've given you the major and perfect interval already, so we don't have to do the first step. So I've given you a perfect fifth from an E to a B. So we can go right to step 2 because you've been given the interval. So we want to increase the size of that perfect interval, I should say major or perfect interval by one semitone. Now we're going to do that by raising the top note. Because we are doing an ascending augmented interval, we can only affect the top note. So we're going to increase the size of that interval, that fifth, by raising it by a semitone by adding a sharp. So that B becomes a B sharp, and we have an augmented interval. You want to keep that a chromatic semitone so that you keep the distance a fifth. Okay, so let's try a third. I've given you the major third from the D to the F sharp, so then we're going to increase it by raising the top note. Now I've given you an F sharp already, so in order to increase that by a semitone, you have to write in an F double sharp. Now an F double sharp is marked by an X, as you see there. What that does is it raises the original F by 2 semitones, so it is 1 semitone higher than an F sharp. So again, that's called an F double sharp marked by an X. Okay, so let's try some examples where I haven't given you the original interval. So I want an augmented fourth. So the first step is to build that major or perfect interval. So in order to do that, we have to count the interval first. So from the F, we count up 4 and write in a B. The second step is to determine the key signature. Now we always take the key signature of the bottom note. So since the bottom note is an F, you are going to be in the key of F major. Now F major's key signature has one flat, which is a B flat. So in order to make that a perfect interval, we have to write in a B flat. So there we have our perfect fourth. Now we want to increase the size of that perfect interval by raising the top note by a semitone. So instead of having a B flat, we're going to get rid of that flat, raise it to just a plain B natural, and just write it as a B. So an F to a B now would be an augmented fourth. Let's try an augmented sixth. So we're going to count up 6 from our E and write in a C. Now we're going to determine the key signature. So the bottom note is E, meaning that the key is E major. Now E major has 4 sharps. Those 4 sharps are F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, and D sharp. Remember that acrostic poem, the Father Charles Goes Down and Ends Battle. It'll help you determine what the sharps are. Okay, so it's got the 4 sharps. So in order to make that a major interval, we have to write that C sharp in, because that C sharp is in the key signature. So there we have our major. Now we have to raise that top note by a semitone. So since it's already a C sharp, you might have guessed already that we have to make it a double sharp. So we write that in by writing that X in. So now we have E to C double sharp, which is an augmented sixth. Our final example for ascending augmented intervals is the augmented unison. So counting from an A, staying since it's a unison, we can just write another A right beside it. Now, because the first one is an A flat, that means your key is A flat. So if you were to go from the first note to the first note, you would have to write in an A flat on the second note to make it a perfect unison. So we don't even have to know the full key signature, we just know that we're going from an A flat to an A flat. Now we need to increase the second note by a semitone, so that A flat is going to become in A natural. Now we have to write in the natural sign this time in order to cancel out the flat, which we've already written in. In other examples like the augmented fourth, we didn't have to write in that natural because we weren't canceling anything from before. So there we have our augmented unison. So let's try some descending augmented intervals. So we're going to build up that interval, major perfect interval, counting down 7 from a G. We're going to end up on an A. So now it's a little bit of trial and error to determine the key. So let's try, because the key is the bottom note, remember, and we don't know what the bottom note is. So let's try just a plain A, because that's what we've got written in right now. So A major would have 3 sharps: F sharp, C sharp, and G sharp. So we can compare those sharps with what notes we have. So we have an A to a G sharp. Since that G sharp is in the key signature, right now we have a major 7th, which is great. So we've got our major interval built. So our next step is to increase the size of that major interval by a semitone. Now this time we have to lower that bottom note by a semitone because we can't change the top note. So in order to make the distance larger between the two notes, we have to lower it by a semitone. Writing in a flat next to the A will make that lower by a semitone. So now we have our augmented 7th. Let's try an augmented 5th. We'll count down 5 and write in E. Now a little trial and error, right? So let's try an E, because that's the first note we've got written in. So E major would have 4 sharps. Those 4 sharps are F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, and D sharp. Now if we compare that with what we've got a B flat in our example. Now nowhere in that key signature is there a B flat written. So we know that that can't be right because the notes we have don't match what we have in the key signatures. We would have a flat written down if it was E. So we can try now E flat. Let's try the key of E flat major. E flat major has 3 flats. It's got a B flat, an E flat, and an A flat. So already you can see that our E flat to B flat in the example match up with the notes in our key signature. So right now we have our perfect 5th, which is great. So we can move on to our second step. Now we need to lower that bottom note by a semitone. Now, since we already have an E flat, we have to make that an E double flat by writing in the second flat to lower it by another semitone. So double flats are marked by writing 2 flats next to each other. A double flat is 2 semitones lower than the original note and 1 semitone lower than the flat note. Okay. Augmented 8th. From a G, counting down 8, which is an octave, remember, which will land us on another G. So our key signature is going to be G to G, as you can tell, so it's just going to be a G major, and we know that that bottom note will match the top note because it's exactly the same note. So right there we've already got it, our perfect octave. So now we have to increase the size of that interval by lowering the bottom note. We can just put in a flat, so that's now a G flat, and the upper octave is just a plain G or G natural. I guess you could write in a cautionary accidental, a natural there, and you'd have your augmented 8th. So this completes our video on augmented intervals.